I want to talk about a plain vanilla interest rate swap. This is the case where one firm wants to borrow at a fixed rate and another firm wants to borrow at a floating rate, a rate that changes over time. Now they may have different needs. For example, banks tend to get their money through deposits, which is a floating rate. That rate goes up and down. But oftentimes they make their money by lending it out, for example, for long-term loans like mortgages. So they have a mismatch. If interest rates were to go up, they would be paying depositors more, but they would be receiving the same amount from their mortgage loans. So that's a real problem. So what can they do? Well, they can swap. And swaps are very similar to trades in sports. Okay? One team may have an abundance of pitchers but need some hitters. Another team may have plenty of hitters and need some pitching. The two teams can swap and they can both be better off. So let's take a look at an example. It's easier to see this concept when we see an example. We're going to have two firms, and we're going to call say the first firm is called AAA, and AAA can borrow at a fixed rate of 12%. And it can also borrow at a floating rate of LIBOR plus 0.25%. LIBOR stands for London Interbank Offer Rate, and it's a short-term floating interest rate. Okay, similar to a treasury bill rate, which is more familiar to you here to us in the U.S. Except the difference is that LIBOR is a private market rate, so there's some default risk involved, where a treasury bill is generally considered risk-free, okay, default-free. And let's say we have a second company called BBB, and they can borrow at a fixed rate of 13% and a floating rate of LIBOR plus 0.5%. Now, as you look at this, you're probably thinking, well, A has a better credit rating and they can borrow in both markets at a cheaper rate. Why would they ever want to swap with B? They want to swap with B because while they have a 0.25% advantage in floating rate borrowing, they have a 1% advantage in fixed rate borrowing. So they have what's called an absolute advantage. Okay, so AAA has an absolute advantage in both markets. Okay, but they have a comparative advantage in fixed rate borrowing. Okay, they've got a bigger advantage. And if you've studied any international trade, we talk about comparative versus absolute advantage all the time. And you can think about it from a personal point of view or from a smaller individual point of view. You may have a lawyer who is also a very good typist. Should they type everything themselves and not give any work to their secretary? Well, that doesn't make any sense because they have a bigger advantage in their knowledge of the law and a smaller advantage in typing, even though they may be a better typist. You give the typing work to your secretary, let your secretary take care of that. You take care of what you have the bigger advantage in. So in this case, A and B can take advantage of this comparative advantage, and you can only have a comparative advantage in one market. So A has a comparative advantage in fixed rate borrowing, B has a comparative advantage in floating rate borrowing. What do I mean by that? Again, I mean that A has a 1% advantage borrowing fixed, only a 1/4% advantage borrowing at a floating rate. All right, so let's see how we can divide this up and make them both better off. So let's draw a little diagram here. And here we'll have AAA. In this case, I'm going to throw a bank in here. We don't have to have a bank. They could do it directly between themselves. And we're going to have BBB over here. Well, in order for the swap to take place, they both have to, A and B both have to raise some money. So we said A has the biggest advantage borrowing in the fixed rate market. So what they're going to do is they're going to issue bonds at 12%. B has the advantage borrowing in the floating rate market, so they're going to borrow at LIBOR plus 0.5%. And again, no matter what LIBOR is, LIBOR can go up and down. If LIBOR is 5%, they pay 5.5%. If it goes to 8%, they pay 8.5%. Now, how are we going to divide this up? Well, how about if A sends LIBOR towards B? So they're going to pay LIBOR to the bank, and the bank is just going to pass that LIBOR over to BBB. And you can see that now the LIBOR cancels. This floating rate, they no longer have a floating rate loan because they're always receiving LIBOR. If they were paying 5.5%, and LIBOR went up to 8%, so now it would be 8.5%. Well, they're paying 8.5%, but they're receiving the 8%, so they're just paying 0.5% here. Let's say B sends 12.25% to the bank. And let's let the bank just send 12% to A. So let's see what's happened here. A issued bonds at 12%. They're receiving 12%. So their fixed rate loan is gone. They're just paying LIBOR. The bank is receiving 12.25%, and they're paying 12%, so they're getting 1/4% for being the intermediary here. Down here, they're receiving LIBOR and just passing that LIBOR on, so they don't receive any of that. So let's see how this works out for everyone. All right, the bank gets 1/4%. Okay, so that's their pay. Let's see what A pays. A is paying LIBOR because this 12% that they receive pays for the 12% bond issue, so they're good there. So in the case of AAA, they're paying LIBOR for this floating rate loan. And how about B? B is paying 12.25%, plus they're paying an extra 0.5% here. So they're paying 12.75%. So they're paying 12.75% for this fixed rate loan. Is everybody better off? Well, the bank made 1/4%. AAA, if they went out into the market themselves, could borrow at LIBOR plus 1/4%, so they're 1/4% better off. BBB, if they went into the marketplace themselves to borrow fixed rate, they would borrow at 13%. They're borrowing at 12.75%. So in this case, everybody made 1/4%. The bank made 1/4%. AAA saved 1/4% on their short-term borrowing or their fixed floating rate borrowing, and BBB saved 1/4% on their fixed rate or long-term borrowing. So everybody's better off. We didn't have to divide it up so that everybody got exactly the same. Okay, we did so here, but you could have had the case where the bank took even less and A and B split the difference. You could have had it where the bank took a little more and A and B got a little bit less. You could have done it a lot of ways. You could have done it without the bank. We could have had it so that A and B went directly to one another, so that they divided up the full 0.75%. Maybe A would have taken 0.5% and B would have taken 0.25%, because A is the more credit-worthy firm. They may have gobbled up a little bit more of the savings. Okay, but anyway, this swap worked out very well for both sides. Okay, B got the fixed rate loan it wanted and saved 0.25%. A's better off because it got the floating rate loan it wanted and saved 0.25%. And the bank that helped to broker this deal got 0.25% as well. So swaps can be very, very useful for firms. Now let me point out that in the case of a swap, you only exchange the interest rate payments. Okay, you don't exchange the principal. So sometimes they refer to that as notional principal. So the loan is based on a certain amount of money, but you don't actually exchange that. Swaps come in more complicated versions. There are exchange rate swaps. There are more complicated interest rate swaps. But this is the simplest case, and you can see that there can be big advantages from engaging in a swap.